Welcome to the video. This is one of the best projects we had in 2025. A previous customer of mine contacted me about a friend of his who had an entry into the Transcontinental, number 11, and they needed a bike. They wanted something specifically for the event, but also to last them beyond the event. So some criteria for the future, broadly, other bike packing, but carrying more stuff and probably more rugged terrain than the 5,000 kilometers that was the TCR. So this is a video of the build of that bike. The TCR that year had about 400 riders, 80 of those were women, and Amy was lucky to get one of the spots. This is her and I outside the cathedral in Santiago where the event started. And I volunteered for the event, and this little crew here was some of the volunteers. We had a jolly good time for the weekend, and then that was the bike when it was finished. But before that, there was some work to do. So we got confirmation in about April, and the event was in August, so not too long to do a bike fit that we did with Foundation Bike Fit in London, and then crack on with the build. A load of Columbus steel tubing of various types, and the sizing that came from the bike fit for Amy. This is my setup and the jig I use. It's the Academy jig that used to be available and I think is now again available in the UK. Quite an affordable setup. And this is some of the process of setting that up. So putting the right spacer in for the right size head tube, then setting the length of the frame where these pillars you can move forwards or backwards for different lengths. There's a set sort of order of setting all this stuff up. From the bike CAD drawings you can get specific dimensions that you then set into the jig, and those sort of pointy arrows in the middle then align with the marks on the ruler. So first movement is setting the front length, and it's not the size of the top tube or anything, it's a different dimension that comes out of bike CAD. And then similar at the back, you can set the length of the chainstays, and then set the bottom bracket drop, which effectively you set by the height of the axle. And then the straightness of the frame is set using this laser that connects to the bottom bracket, and then you align to where the top of the seat post goes up there. And then similarly to the rear axle setup and the head tube, the rear axle has a whole bunch of possible ways that it can be out of true. So this is perpendicular to the bottom bracket, so it checks that it's basically flat and in the same plane as the bottom bracket, and then you check for the head tube being perpendicular to that, as well as the straightness of the axle sort of left and right, if that makes sense, so that the wheel is perpendicular to the frame. So the same bit of the jig gets bolted on the back, and then you can measure between this plate and the path of the rear axle. All of this, yeah, it's a bit of a fiddle, but it's very flexible for lots of different shapes and sizes, and you can get pretty accurate using this if you take your time. It's also very easy to not be accurate. If you're a little bit out at the front near the bottom bracket, by the time you get to the wheel, you could be 1 millimeter, 2 millimeters out, which will show up in a frame a lot. So then next is into the tubing. This is what's nicely called a butt checker. You can check the tube for butts. So and the butting is different thickness, wall thickness of the tubing. At the ends they tend to be thicker where you're going to weld it, and for lightness they thin out in the middle. So it's good to know where that location is when you're cutting the tube down. You don't want to cut the whole of the butt off. And then we're moving on to starting the build. So this is the bottom of the seat tube where the bottom bracket goes. So in this video I decided to give myself a little test, which obviously didn't go too badly because it made it to the video. You can cut these miters, these curves in the tubes, by having hole saws and setting them up in machines, in milling machines or lathes or whatever, to cut these, or you can kind of do it freehand, and you could do it with a file, which is how most people start, but I tend to use my favourite hammer, the angle grinder. Once you've got a bit of practice with one of those, you can remove an awful lot of material really quickly, and once you've got used to the shapes that you're trying to cut, you can cut that shape by eye. I do put the pen mark on there. It's not really to cut exactly to the line, it just kind of gives you an indication of the curve that you're aiming for, rather than having nothing. So you need to cut the top as it was, sort of lying on its side, or one side and the other side. They've obviously got to be cut to the same depth, they've got to be round to the bottom bracket size, but you can get pretty close like that in using the angle grinder, and it's really fast. It might take 20 minutes or whatever, even if it's all available to set a milling machine up to cut a tube like that, whereas literally in 5 minutes you can probably do it with an angle grinder and finish it off with the file. So the way I do that is with the angle grinder, test it with the square, see if it's close. This was fairly close. I think the curve had a little flat in the bottom, so there's a little bit of wiggle. Just need to take out with the hand file and remove the burrs with the hand file, and there was a bit of a flat side to that near side of the tube, you can see. So remove that, but a little bit of fiddling with the file, you can just see there's a little bit of wiggle there because it's too wide and flat in the bottom of the curve. So take that curve out with the file, put it flat out with the file, and then 5 minutes later that fits. When I'm building a frame, if I do them this way, I reckon about half an hour per mitre as a sort of rough time scale. Some of them take longer than others, but on the main front tubes, you can kind of get close to that if the wind's blowing in the right direction. So that's the bottom bracket. This one's got pre-cut holes in, saves having to drill them, saves a minute or two. And you might not be able to tell in this picture, some of the tubes we're using, you won't be able to tell in this picture because that tube is round. Some of the tubes we're using, the down tube, speaking of which, is one of the Columbus Max down tubes, so it isn't round. It's flared in both in alternative directions. So at the head tube it's flat in its up and down plane to give stiffness to the head tube, and at the bottom brackets it's side to side to give stiffness at the bottom bracket. So the bottom of the down tube was cut in the same way as the seat tube, so I won't show you that again, but then you've got to match it to the top. So you've got the length of the frame set in the jig, and that was sort of marking up the head tube to cut the big bit you're definitely not going to use at the end. You can just see in that shot that the head tube is ovalised, which is what I meant. So ovalised in the plane up the head tube. So you can cut the chunk of material off the top, and then it's kind of creep up on the dimension that you want to make sure that the down tube is the right length, which takes a minute. Particularly using an angle grinder, you can remove an awful lot of material really quickly. So you start long like this, so it's obviously too long, it's too high up the head tube, and you can see roughly how much needs to come off. But it's caution is the word here. Ask me how I know. So yeah, you can creep up on that dimension of cutting out the miters that are needed for that to fit the head tube and be the right length for the frame. Otherwise you end up with short frames. So again, with the angle grinder cutting disc, you can cut out a good chunk before shoving the grinding disc back in and removing material. ultimately you try and get, you know, as close as you can, as quick as you can, best use of time, and then we'll end up finishing it off with the hand file when it gets close. It can be difficult to judge, and particularly with a non-round tube, it sort of changes shape as the mitre changes shape. So by doing the top part, then you can see that you then need to take some off the bottom. Again, give it a rough curve. I know that's a bottom bracket and not a head tube, but they are similar sizes, and as I say, it's not really to cut to the line. Health and safety in action. It's not really to cut to the line, it's to give an idea of the curve, and particularly with a tube that's ovalized, you're obviously trying to keep the mitre in line with the shape of the tube as well. Otherwise that will look really obvious if it's not in the right plane when it's finished. So there's a bit of backwards and forwards with the grinding, and then, which thankfully I sped up. This could be a long video otherwise. And then finish off with the hand file, and then you're looking for, obviously, you know, a good fit around there, and the down tube being down to the right height against the head tube, which that was just about there. And then next up is there is an interference between the seat tube and the bottom of the down tube in this frame. So we lock the seat tube into place, and obviously check that it's in the middle of the bottom bracket, which sounds really easy, but particularly with the light shining on things and rulers, you know, you have to triple check that for sure. And I made a little extra nubbin that went on the frame jig to stop the seat post moving side to side once you got it in the right place. And then you could mark up the bottom of the down tube where you need to remove material, and then it's same sort of process. So start gently, remove a bit, see how it looks. Once you've done, you know, a number of these, you start getting used to the shapes and the amount of material to take off, but it is so easy to take a chunk off with an angle grinder. And now there's a fair amount of time invested in that down tube, not to mention how much they cost. So you don't want to mess this up. So caution is the word. Creep up on it, and then eventually you get to the point where that fits reasonably. There's still a little gap at the bottom, so still a little bit more to come out. And whilst we're getting there, also checking that the down tube is central. That mitre that's cut in it obviously has to be in the middle. So there's some checking with lining up that on the seat tube and making sure it's in the middle on the bottom bracket. And eventually you get to having something that fits okay like that. And then moving on, last one at the front is then the top tube. Similar sort of process. You mark out where it is, how low you want it at the back, how flat you want your top tube, and try and get your big bald head out of the way. And then it's pretty much the same process. You cut out those mitres, and hey presto, top tube is fitted. The seat tube and head tube are not parallel, so you do have to creep up on it, otherwise you end up with a top tube too short. So there's ways of which approach that. And then this is moving on to the back of the bike. This one, they wanted a UDH setup, so the SRAM Universal Derailleur Hanger setup, which I had to then, it was the first time I'd done one, so I didn't have the tools for it, so I had to make a bit of tooling to go in the jig and change one of the axles, or made the axle actually, the dummy axle for the jig. And this is how the UDH setup ends up. You end up with the derailleur hanger that has a bit of movement in it, but it is made of some sort of plastic resin, so you can't weld it. you can't weld when it's in the jig, and it takes up some of the space of the axle, so you have to make some spaces and dummy parts to fit in there, such so that the jig holds the right hand side chainstay in the right place, which is what all that gubbins was on the lathe. So a few spaces that go in there, so that you don't have to ruin a derailleur hanger. And then the particular chainstays for this, so Amy wanted to be able to run, she was running 650B wheels, and wanted to be able to run 2.1 tyres. After the event, I think on the event we were running 47C gravel tyres. So the chainstays had to have a bit of space in there, and obviously not too much, because we had to clear the cranks. And then on to the seat stays, and for me this is the trickiest, most time consuming, cutting the tops of the seat stays. Again, so many ways they can not be straight, particularly when you've got curves in them, so they can, you know, not be in the same plane, they can not be the same height, not the same width. So a lot of time is spent making sure all of those things are correct. These ones we specially bent as well, using flat mount brakes. The bottoms generally can't be straight, so otherwise they don't clear the disc brake caliper. So put a bend in the bottom to clear the disc brake caliper, and then because the tyres are quite big, we wanted to put an extra bit of a kink in the top to give enough clearance. Which also meant that they fitted nicely on the sides of the seat tube, which actually makes doing the miters there a little bit easier. But yeah, a fair amount of time is taken, and that's probably the one place I would like to get a machine set up to cut those miters, because it takes an age, and it's very easy to have them not quite in the same plane as each other. So as it's that tricky, there's a lot of hand filing. You don't get too far with the angle grinder, again, otherwise you end up with very short seat stays if you're not careful. And I think, to me, it's one of the areas of the bike that the frame that really does have an aesthetic influence of the bike, how that all fits around the seat tube and that cluster of tubes there. So that's those two in place, and then I wanted to put a little bridge between them, not because it needed it for brakes or anything, but just for a bit of support. There's a fair amount of weight potentially on the back of the bike. So this is a tube roller, so roll some tubing, and you think it looks really bendy or really bent when it's in there, and you put it up against the frame, it almost looks flat, almost looks straight. So once that was done, then into brazing, so just a few snaps of some of the brazing of the frame. Yeah, so that's all brass brazed. I don't tend to file them too much, it takes a lot of time. And I should say this was under quite a bit of time pressure, so by the time we got the bike fit done and the frame design done, we had not many weeks. Obviously need to leave time to get it painted and do the build as well. So and that was the bridge that went in, which I did end up bending a bit more just to give it a bit more clearance and aesthetic, I think. And then infinite number of braze-ons on frames these days. How many bottle bosses do you want? So include a little bit of brazing in here. So this is putting the bottle mounts, or brazing, silver soldering I should say. Putting the bottle mounts, these ones in the underneath the down tube, a bit more carrying capacity. So they're stainless bottle bosses. Obviously they're the one area where it's easy to rub paint or break through paint or whatever, so always good to have as many of the bosses as possible to be stainless. And then silver soldered on. You can see as it heats up, you can just about see it in the video. We'll look at the next one. So the flux that's there is the white paste. You heat that up now in fast forward, and you see the heat going into the tube, and the flux goes clear, and then you apply the silver. It's good to set the frame up so you can do as many in one hit as possible, because otherwise it's a fiddle. So this way you could get basically 2 setups for most of them. So you could do the ones on the bottom of the tubes with that setup, and then ones on the top tube, and the top of the down tube could be done in this setup. I like that. And a little bit of tidy up on the head tube brazing, because there were a few little ugly bits. Again, this tool was not a copy, but a semi-copy of one from Tom Ritchie ages ago, but really helpful for doing that. And then fork, we were lucky enough to get a hold of a Fairlight fork, nicely made, all the features, all the bosses, standard, gravel fork, but yeah, a nice one. Internal bits of routing for hoses and stuff, so that's all grand. But we wanted to make sure it's the right or the same colour rather than have it black, so it gets all the bits and pieces taken off it, and a rub down before painting. I should say the frame was being powder coated. Obviously it's going into a fairly competitive environment, so although paint could be fine, it's just a bit more rugged with powder coat. This is some epoxy primer that's gone on, give it a good base coat, and this was the colour that Amy chose, which looks a bit red on the screen but it's quite pink in the daylight. This is under sort of orange light, but yeah, when it came outside it was super bright pink colour. It was lovely. And there we go, that's the frame basically finished. Fork going in there. We were really lucky and thankful to have a bit of support from Redshift, so we got a stem, flex stem, and seat post for it. Super good for extra comfort on, well, when you're doing 5,000 kilometers, a lot of which was on pretty bad roads or off-road. And the old head badge on there. That was the frame finished up before it went off for its build. Logos had gone on, and then we were working with Seabass Cycles in London, who were going to do the parts provision and build of the bit. So delivery date eventually arrived. I think we were about 3 or 4 weeks before the event, 4 weeks maybe, to get it to Seabass, and then they did their great job of putting all the parts on, some of which were from that Amy already had, and then delivery day. Very nice to get it there. And then ultimately when it all started kicking off in front of the cathedral, and then there's just a few pictures from the event. That was the first night stop. I was reliably involved, and obviously nutritional preferences, but yeah, just a few pictures from the event. As I say, the TCR is normally around 4,000 kilometers. I think it was a bit of a surprise to those entered that this version was about 5,000 that went through Spain, France, Italy, so the Tourmalet, I think, and then through France, and getting across to a ferry in Bari on the east of Italy before shooting across the water into Eastern Europe and making their way to Romania, Constanta in Romania, where the finish was. As I say, we got a few other videos coming. Yeah, we were doing a bit of dot watching as Amy finished amazingly and gets all the 6 stamps in there. So amazing achievement for her. yeah, we've got a few other videos coming of interviews sort of pre and post event. So if you want to see those, or if you're thinking of ever entering, give those a look. And thanks very much.